When we think of the Roman Empire, we often picture mighty legions, magnificent architecture, and the grandeur of classical civilization. But beneath this veneer of order and law lay a thriving shadow economy that was just as essential to Rome's survival as its famous roads and aqueducts. The black market of ancient Rome was not a marginal phenomenon, but rather an integral part of the imperial economic machinery, feeding the appetites of the wealthy, supplying the demands of the masses, and in many ways sustaining the very empire that sought to control it. The story of Rome's illegal trade begins with understanding that the Roman economy was built on a fundamental contradiction. The empire prided itself on law, order, and control, yet its insatiable appetite for luxury goods, slaves, and exotic commodities created opportunities for those willing to operate outside legal boundaries. Trade was indeed the backbone of Roman prosperity, with goods flowing across the Mediterranean and beyond, from Britain to India, from the Rhine to the Nile. But alongside this legitimate commerce ran parallel channels of illegal exchange that were equally vital to the empire's functioning. Perhaps no aspect of Rome's black market was more significant than the illegal slave trade. Slavery was the engine of the Roman economy, with estimates suggesting that approximately 15% of the empire's population consisted of enslaved people. While the capture of prisoners in warfare provided a legal source of slaves, this supply was irregular and dependent on military campaigns. Enter the pirates, particularly the infamous Cilicians, who operated from the rocky southern coast of what is now Turkey. These pirates didn't just raid ships, they systematically kidnapped people from coastal communities and sold them into slavery. The island of Delos became the epicenter of this trade, and historical records indicate that on particularly busy days, 10,000 slaves passed through its markets in a single 24-hour period. What makes this situation remarkable is Rome's complicity in this illegal activity. The Cilician pirates were technically enemies of the state, yet wealthy Romans relied heavily on them to supply slaves for their massive agricultural estates. This created a perverse situation where powerful business interests in Rome actively lobbied against serious anti-piracy measures. The pirates understood they were serving Roman needs, and for decades, the Republic turned a blind eye to their activities. It wasn't until the pirates became so bold that they started raiding Italian coastal towns and disrupting Rome's grain supply that the Senate finally took decisive action. In 67 BCE, Pompey the Great was given extraordinary powers to eliminate the pirate threat, which he accomplished in a remarkably swift 3-month campaign. But even this didn't end the illegal slave trade. The demand was too great. After Pompey's victory, Rome continued to rely on pirates for slaves, and cities like Side in Cilicia prospered as administrative centers for the Mediterranean slave trade well into the imperial period. The illegal trafficking of enslaved people involved sophisticated evasion tactics that would be familiar to modern-day smugglers. A recently deciphered papyrus from the Judean desert, dating to approximately 1900 years ago, details an elaborate tax evasion scheme involving the false sale and manumission of slaves. The Roman Empire imposed at least 5 different types of taxes on slave transactions, including taxes on purchase, ownership, export, and freeing of slaves. The 2 men described in this document allegedly engaged in bogus sales and fraudulent manumissions to avoid these levies. The penalties for such crimes were severe. Romans did not take kindly to tax evasion, viewing it essentially as treason against the state. Punishments could include substantial fines, permanent exile, or hard labor in mines and quarries, conditions that amounted to a death sentence. Tax evasion itself was a cornerstone of Rome's black market economy. The imperial tax system was notoriously rigid yet deeply flawed, creating countless opportunities for fraud. Taxes were levied on land, trade goods, imports, exports, and virtually every economic transaction. The system of tax farming, whereby private contractors called publicani paid the government up front for the right to collect taxes, was particularly prone to corruption. These tax collectors had every incentive to overcharge citizens to turn a profit, leading to widespread abuse, bribery, and extortion. A 2nd-century papyrus from Oxyrhynchus in Egypt records the trial of a wealthy man named Papyrus, accused of forging tax receipts to avoid his financial obligations. This wasn't an isolated incident. Historical sources reference tax riots, organized fraud schemes, and corrupt officials routinely skimming from collections. Smuggling to avoid customs duties was another major component of the Roman underground economy. While goods moving within the empire faced a relatively modest duty of 1/40th of their value, imports from outside imperial borders could face taxes as high as 1/4 of their worth. This created powerful incentives to smuggle high-value, low-bulk items. Port duties on goods entering and leaving the empire provided significant state revenue, but they also created opportunities for those with knowledge of hidden coves and corrupt officials. Merchants would offload portions of their cargo at unauthorized locations before officially arriving at port with the remainder. The goods most commonly smuggled were those with the highest taxes or the greatest value relative to their size. Items like precious gems from India, which were easy to conceal and enormously profitable. The trade in luxury goods reveals another fascinating dimension of Rome's black market. Silk from China became so coveted that Romans used it as a form of currency in Central Asia. The Chinese carefully guarded the secret of silk production for centuries, maintaining a monopoly that allowed them to command extraordinary prices. The journey of silk from China to Rome involved multiple intermediaries, each taking their cut, and the final product in Roman markets cost its weight in gold. The 3rd century Emperor Aurelian famously refused to buy his wife a silk shawl dyed with Tyrian purple because the cost was simply too astronomical, even for an emperor. This demand for silk, combined with trade disruptions caused by wars with Persia, created opportunities for smugglers and black market dealers. The most remarkable smuggling operation in Roman history occurred in the mid-6th century when 2 Christian monks, with the backing of Emperor Justinian, traveled to China and smuggled silkworm eggs back to the Byzantine Empire hidden in hollow bamboo canes. This act of industrial espionage broke China's silk monopoly and established a domestic Byzantine silk industry that would last for 650 years. While supported by the emperor, this was technically smuggling of the highest order, stealing the most closely guarded trade secret of the age. Purple dye presents another example of how legal restrictions created black markets. Tyrian purple, extracted from murex snails found along the Phoenician coast, was fabulously expensive to produce. It took approximately 12,000 snails to produce just 1.5 grams of dye, barely enough to color the trim of a single garment. The dye was worth its weight in silver and eventually gold. By the 4th century, Roman sumptuary laws restricted the wearing of Tyrian purple to the emperor alone. Violating this prohibition was considered treason and punishable by death. Yet the demand for purple-dyed cloth remained high among the wealthy elite, creating a market for illegal dye production and smuggled purple garments. People found ways to create purple dyes from less expensive sources or to acquire genuine Tyrian purple through illicit channels. The very exclusivity that made purple so desirable also made its illegal trade so profitable. The relationship between Rome and its black market was characterized by pragmatic hypocrisy. The empire needed what illegal traders provided, whether it was slaves for agriculture, luxury goods for the elite, or tax revenue that somehow still flowed despite widespread evasion. Roman authorities would periodically crack down on illegal activities, particularly when they became too blatant or threatened state interests. But they rarely sought to eliminate these underground economies entirely. The campaigns against the Cilician pirates, for instance, only occurred when piracy began threatening Rome's food supply and raiding Italian shores. As long as the pirates confined themselves to kidnapping Greeks, Egyptians, and other non-Romans for the slave markets, Rome was content to benefit from their activities. This pragmatic approach extended to tax enforcement as well. While the penalties for tax fraud were theoretically severe, enforcement was inconsistent and often dependent on one's social connections. Wealthy aristocrats could afford skilled lawyers and had political connections that might shield them from prosecution, while ordinary citizens faced the full weight of Roman justice. The system itself encouraged corruption, with tax collectors operating as private contractors who profited from overcharging. This created a vicious cycle where citizens felt justified in evading unjust taxes, which in turn led to harsher collection methods. The infrastructure of Rome's black market was surprisingly sophisticated. Smugglers maintained networks of informants in harbors who would report on ship cargoes and destinations, allowing pirates to target valuable shipments. Underground trade routes bypassed official ports where customs duties would be collected. Forgers created false documents to facilitate illegal transactions. Money launderers helped hide the proceeds of illegal activities. The basic structures and techniques that characterize organized crime today were all present in the Roman world, adapted to ancient technologies and social structures, but fundamentally similar in their objectives and methods. What's perhaps most striking is how Rome's black market reflected the contradictions at the heart of the empire itself. Rome was built on conquest and exploitation, taking resources and people from subjugated territories to feed the appetites of the capital. Yet it also promoted itself as a bringer of civilization, law, and order. The black market existed in the space between these two realities, providing the goods and services that the official economy couldn't or wouldn't supply, while operating outside the legal structures the empire claimed to uphold. In many ways, the illegal economy was more honest about Rome's true nature than the legal one, openly acknowledging the empire's dependence on exploitation, luxury, and the systematic violation of its own stated principles. The legacy of Rome's black market offers lessons that remain relevant today. It demonstrates that where there is demand and opportunity, illegal trade will flourish regardless of legal prohibitions or moral condemnations. It shows how governments often tolerate or even tacitly support black market activities when those activities serve state interests or powerful constituencies. It reveals how legal restrictions, whether on trade goods or social status, often create the very black markets they're intended to prevent. And it illustrates how underground economies can become so integral to a society's functioning that eliminating them becomes virtually impossible without fundamentally restructuring the entire economic system. The Roman Empire eventually fell, but not before its shadow economy had played a crucial role in both its rise and its decline. The same illegal trade networks that helped build Roman prosperity also contributed to its weakening, as tax evasion reduced state revenues, piracy disrupted commerce, and widespread corruption undermined institutional legitimacy. When Rome could no longer maintain security across its vast territories, the Mediterranean, once called Mare Nostrum or Our Sea by confident Romans, became a dangerous frontier infested with pirates once more. The black market that had fed the empire ultimately outlasted it, as smugglers, pirates, and tax evaders continued to ply their trades long after the last emperor had fallen. In the end, the underground economy proved more resilient than the legal structures built to contain it, a testament to the enduring power of human ingenuity in pursuit of profit, regardless of the laws designed to stop it.